Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Section 42. Subsection 3. At some remote point in time, detached, it appeared, from all previous times and experiences, Neville became aware that he was in bed, and that his consciousness was still attached to his body, but that, at first, was the utmost extent to which his perception reached. It was as if he were in a little circle. Within the circle there was a sensation of touch, and even tiny and minute sounds. There was also a faint taste on his lips, but nothing else. And beyond the circle there was nothing at all. There was, at first, even no memory. He knew nothing except that he was in bed. Where, how, or what it was all about, or what time it was, or whether it was day or night. Of these things he knew nothing. Then, like transparent walls, this circle began to glimmer into shadows, at first only of memory. He began to remember his last experience. It was of talking to Jim. Towards the end of that talking, a new kind of pain had begun in his head, and he remembered that he had told Jim to ring the bell, because he was aware he would presently collapse again, and Jim mustn't be frightened. He had been also able to hold on till Jim had kissed him. He had been able even to say goodbye. Then, when he had heard the soft closing of the inner bay's door, he had let out his agony in one long moan. The pain had really been intolerable, partly because it was so new and unusual. Things that had happened after that were vague and confused. Aunt Anna had been by him for certain moments. He had smelled a particular fragrance which he associated with her. His arm had been lifted and his hands held, and he remembered, supposing that someone was giving him morphia again. But he had not been able to attend to these things. The blue lights in his head that quivered before him like a permanent lightning flash shaken from side to side had occupied him entirely. All this had gone on for a long time. He had heard someone moaning ceaselessly. It had been quite a while before he had understood that it was himself. Yet once more, as after his operation, he had perceived that pain was one thing, and himself another. And by stretching the whole force of his will, he could keep them so. He must not let the pain come any nearer. He knew that. That had been the last thing that he could remember. And now, here he was back again, and just at present there was no pain, at least no actual pain. It was like hearing a tune hummed over only. After a while, not merely memory, but present perception began to disclose itself, and the circular wall melted yet further. And he understood that someone once more was holding his hand, someone on either side. That seemed an inexpressible comfort. He moved his hands a little to reassure himself that it was really so. Then his right hand was relinquished, but he twisted it to show that he wanted it to be held again, and another hand came down on it. But, simultaneously, a damp, faintly stinging thing passed across his forehead, down his face, and into the corners of his mouth. He sucked greedily, and was aware of the taste of lemon. That was delicious. He felt, too, a very faint, soothing breeze all over his face. Again the circular walls had grown even more transparent, and he perceived, he did not know how, that there were people in the room. He must ask who was there. But there was no answer. He wondered whether he really had spoken. He would try again. This time there came an answer, and he knew it for Aunt Anna's whisper. "Yes, my darling." Ah, that was all right. He was really in communication with people, but hadn't she heard what he had said? He must say it again. A voice began buzzing in answer. How could he possibly hear if people spoke so fast? They must speak slowly. He would say so. That was better. Oh, Algie was there, was he? Then it must be after 11. He was to have been here by 11 today. Or was it yesterday? Or last week? Well, he was here. Good old Algie. Who else? Oh, Masterson was here, was he? And Mrs. Templemore, and Charleston, and Nurse Deacon. Wait, that's too fast. Nurse Deacon, and Aunt Anna. But why wasn't Mr. Morpeth here? He wanted Mr. Morpeth. He would say so. Oh, Mr. Morpeth had been sent for, had he? That was all right. And Father Richardson? Father Richardson? He had been here, had he? And gone again? But would be back soon. Speak more slowly, Aunt Anna, please. That was better. He could understand it like that. Father Richardson has been here and has said all the prayers for the dying. For the dying? Was he dying? Of course he was. What a fool he was to forget that. That was why everyone was here. Dying. He fell into an interior musing upon the word, and the walls appeared to grow a little opaque again as he meditated. He could only contemplate one thought at a time, the thoughts that he had rehearsed so often lately. Dying. But death was something quite different. Dying hurt so cruelly because one was still alive. That was no reason for thinking that death would hurt too. Dying hurt, but death was not come, not because it was. Well, if death did not hurt, if death ended the pain of dying, what would death begin? Obviously, it must begin something. He suddenly began to think of the Grail. He had talked about the Grail quite lately to someone. Oh yes, to Jim. Well, drinking the Grail was very bitter. Enid had first really set his lips to it, and then the physical pain had begun a little later. But when the Grail was empty, when the moment came that the last drops had been swallowed, what then? Obviously, the first long draught of new air must be sweet. The Grail! That was the cup of sacrifice, was it not? That was why he had had to drink it. Old Morpeth had told him about that. It was for his father, among other things. So here he was, in the bed in which his father died, and in the same room. What a fool he had been about this room! The shadows were only dreadful, so long as one looked at them from the light. There was no real harm in them when one stepped forward into the midst. Yes, that lemon taste was delicious, and it was very pleasant to have one's hands held. Then he began to wonder whether anyone else were in the room. He was sure Aunt Anna hadn't finished her list. What about the doctor? He must ask. No, it was not worth the trouble. He would think about death instead. Then, imperceptibly, the walls closed about him again, but he did not notice them. He was considering death. Subsection 4. Once again, at some remote point in time, detached from all experience, he found that his consciousness was still attached to his body. But it was attached in a new kind of way. He was aware that somewhere in the universe, as if at an enormous depth beneath the point where he himself stood poised, great wheels of blue flame were all crashing and whirling together. The clamor of them was incredible, harsh and grinding. But they no longer affected him. There was a loud rasping sound of breathing, too, such as he had heard when his father died. Then, through the crashing and the gasping, he had heard the thunder of a voice repeating Latin. He was as a man who, at the edge of a huge chasm, himself at ease and safety, looked down on the tumult below, where great forces strive together. Dying, then, was still in process somewhere, and he watched with a kind of pity that dreadful conflict that roared below. It was to him, in some sense, that Latin was spoken, and he understood its power. Here and there he could catch a phrase. He was being bidden to go forth in the name of powers and principalities, of all those great existences which, he knew now, waited invisible in that wide expanse that was all about him, poised here above the struggle that raged beneath. It was down there, then, that all those whom he loved waited about his struggling body. He knew they were there, as a man who has climbed to a great height knows, as he looks back, that there in the valley are the fields and the houses that he knows so well. They were all in the surge and the stress still, Aunt Anna and the servants and Algie and the old man, who could not be long after him now. There in that plain from which rose up the great words of power that battled with the roar of the pulses in his head, and the blinding shocks of pain, and the fighting for breath. And not with these, only or chiefly, but with the rushing tides of evil and revolt that swayed and tossed, seen by him from up here as a great tumbling torrent or a tossing waste of water looked down upon by a man on a cliff. But he himself was far off and remote. Where, then, was he? Then, as he considered this, he, too, began to thrill and vibrate. From beneath rose up thin, imperceptible tides, or, rather, he perceived now for the first time that he was in them still, that he was not yet as wholly apart as he had thought from all acts and violations and experiences. But they were thin and subtle, as benefited his new condition, and he saw that he could yet act. Then a great and piercing sorrow surged through him, not indeed at the memory of his sins and rebellions, but at his consciousness of their very essence. It was not that his life passed before him as a series or progress of events, but that the quality of it, as he had lived it, had a thin and bitter aroma which he had never suspected. And as there met him from above that piercing breath of the world to which he went, as clean and sharp and radiant as the light reflected from snow, these two tides mingled in him like a chord of sorrow and love and ecstasy. Every image faded from him, every symbol and memory died. The chasm passed into nothingness, and the grail was drunk, and colors passed into whiteness, and sounds into the silence of life, and the initiation was complete. The end.